Ladies, gentlemen, and exiles of all ages, as you push through into the end game and even further beyond into the grand grind that it offers, there are tons of systems piled on into the game, introducing a load of new activities and mechanics that you won't have had to think about previously, or even new ways to use pre-existing tools. And now that I'm personally hitting tier 10 Waystones with no signs of stopping, my build is just sort of walking through thoroughly juiced maps for the tier at least. There's a lot of things that I've learned either from other players or just from my own mistakes that I made along the way. So today we're going to talk about a whole bunch of tips or suggestions for specifically the sort of middle endgame part of your Path of Exile journey, in the hopes that I can help you avoid some of the mistakes that I made myself, especially for players who never got to the endgame of Path of Exile 1. The big thing that I want to start by talking about is anointing your amulet, or instilling as it is referred to in Path of Exile 2. When you engage with the delirium endgame activity within maps, you will start to collect items called distilled emotions, distilled greed, distilled ire, distilled fear. All of these are just examples of what these items are. The main purpose of these is potentially a very large power increase for your build that many people just aren't aware of, which is giving you a notable from the passive skill tree for free. If you have ever pressed Alt while looking through the skill tree, you may have seen that the notables specifically, which are the larger passives with unique names that are smaller than keystones, they have extra text under them that say distilled emotions and then list 3 of them, with it being a different order or a different listing of them depending on which notable it is. This is the specific arrangement of distilled emotions that will allow you to instill that notable onto your amulet. If you right click onto a distilled emotion, you get the pop-up for the window, you put in your distillations, you put in the amulet that you want to craft into, and then you will have the actual passive active as long as you wear that amulet, even if it is on the opposite side of the passive tree with no connecting nodes. My current passive that I get from this is specifically Tainted Strike, which you can see all the way over here. I have nothing connected to it, but you can see that it's still lit up due to it being on my actual amulet because of this system. Generally speaking, the best uses of this are like this, to get notables that just wouldn't be feasible for you to get without spending a load of passive points to reach over to them. And it's worth mentioning that the developers are of course very aware of the general value of the system, and so things like what I have currently in Tainted Strike, like I mentioned, only requires relatively easy to find distilled emotions from this activity, whereas something like Lightning Quick as a notable passive over here requires much more rare and difficult to find distilled emotions, just because it's a much stronger passive as far as the devs are concerned. Of course, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't actually use this system until you have the rare items, even though it is something that you cannot remove from your amulet, because I promise you will not be using the same amulet in a few hours, whether that's 5, 10, 15, 20 hours from now, depends on your progression and how good your amulet is, but within that time, you may as well get some kind of power boost from this system. Why wait to get your end game distillations going if you can just find a notable that helps your build and isn't going to break the bank in the time being? Another tip while we're here, you can actually also use this system with Waystones to give them bonus modifiers too, one of which will make you essentially just be in a sort of constant delirium fog. You don't get bonus distilled emotions from this happening, but it affects monster density and can even spawn unique delirium bosses in your maps with full-sized boss loot tables on maps that would just otherwise not have been there if they didn't have delirium or bosses as a normal affix. So pure gain right there, especially with the cheaper and more plentiful distillations that you can collect. Next up, and on a somewhat similar note, persistent buff auras are extremely strong. The spirit skills, and among these, something that is standing out pretty much just among every class for one build or another, are the herald skills specifically. There are 3 of them, and what they do is just have different elemental effects. Herald of Ice creates massive pops of damage when you shatter frozen enemies with attacks, Herald of Ash causes explosions based on the overkill damage that you do when you kill an enemy, and Herald of Thunder gives you a bunch of bonus lightning bolts on attacks when you kill shocked enemies. All of these are scaled quite highly in their actual numbers, and if you're using any of their related elements within your build, I generally recommend using the appropriate one of these Herald skills if you aren't already, with Herald of Ice being the generally most powerful one individually at the moment. Past this, there are also a couple of specific passive clusters to consider in your passive tree if you already were using the Herald skills, which I know a lot of players are. Specifically, Coming Calamity over here is a very nice cluster here, especially the notable within it. This gives you 50% increased damage with the related element of each Herald skill you have active. So I have Herald of Ice and Herald of Thunder. That means that I have 50% increased cold damage and 50% increased lightning damage, which is a lot of stats for the one node. Not to mention there's a lot of just buffs around here to the Heralds in the cluster too, and then there's another cluster down near the bottom as well, over here for the Doomsayer cluster. This doesn't boost your general damage so much as just boost your actual Herald skills themselves, increasing their area of effect and their damage, as well as of course the nodes around them to increase it too. Both of these are notable passives as well, it's worth pointing out, and to drive the point home from the last tip, you can apply either one of these with distilled emotions to your amulet if you have the right ones, even if you're going nowhere close to the right side or to the bottom of the skill tree either. The next one is going to be obvious to some but not to the others, but the difference between increased and more in actual text within this game is very, very important of a thing to understand. The devs are very careful careful with the wording of every tooltip and how it interacts with the game mechanically, and if something says that it will increase, it is an additive modifier, where if something says that it will give you more of something, it is multiplicative. For example, if you have 10% increased lightning damage, you will do 110% lightning damage. If you get a second instance of 10% increased lightning damage, you will go up to doing 120% lightning damage. But instead, if it said 10% more lightning damage, the first one would still give you up to 110% lightning damage, but then the second one would put you up to 121% lightning damage, because each separate instance of the word more multiplies against each other after the fact, whereas increased adds on top of each other. Think of the increased damage modifiers as adding more rooms to a house, and the more damage modifiers as adding another floor. If you have a single-story house with 3 rooms and you add a room, you've got 4 rooms. If you take a house with 3 rooms and add a second floor on top of all of them, you've got 6 rooms. Obviously, the rooms can be different sizes, the analogy isn't perfect, but the point is that while damage increases are great and important in general, knowing the difference between increased damage and more damage will help you a lot in the long run, and being aware that there are these types of specificities all along the way that the modifiers work in the game is important to understanding stats in Path of Exile 2. Next up is don't forget the simpler power increases. One thing I see a lot of people ignore, especially early endgame and sometimes carrying into the middle endgame too, is just not increasing the quality of their skill gems. It only takes a few of the gem cutters, prisms, currency items to get a skill to max quality. And while not every skill gets massive boost from this, some of them absolutely do, and oftentimes it's the ones that people put at the core of their build as well. You can see what quality will add to a skill gem by holding Alt while hovering over it, so you don't waste it on the wrong one, of course, but some examples of the different outcomes, there are things like Combat Frenzy. This actually doesn't give you any bonus from quality, at least currently at the current moment of the game. Tempest Flurry gives you increased melee strike range with the attack itself, so you can use it from a safer distance. Falling Thunder gives you a chance to not consume power charges on use, which is very, very good. And Charge Staff, which applies a sort of buff to you for a duration at the cost of power charges, has a longer duration per charge with quality. It increases the maximum duration of the effect too, so for obvious reasons, I wouldn't bother putting quality on Combat Frenzy based on what I said there. Tempest Flurry is sort of like a maybe a middle priority at best, but then Falling Thunder gives a large potential damage output increase if you increase its quality, and Charge Staff gives not only a lot of comfort from less brain power spent managing a timed buff, but also lets me spend more power charges on other sources, essentially making it an offense increase as well. On a similar note, there are Glassblower's Baubles, which give you increased quality for your flasks, and these are a bit less high priority. Instead, I mention it because generally I find it's easier to just keep an eye out for white flasks that have quality on them when they drop while doing maps, and then rolling your affixes on them afterwards to get decent flasks. This one was 9% quality when I picked it up with no bonuses. I rolled a couple of solid modifiers on it, then I applied a Val Orb, and it jumped up to 17% quality for a last level buff to it. So for flasks, I recommend specifically trying to craft your own off of decent base quality drops, and while I mentioned Val Orbs here, I think there are a lot of crafting interactions that people are underusing in the game. Other examples including that you can use all of the various orbs on jewels that drop for your passive skill tree sockets, and I mean like all of the different orbs you can use on these. You can make these way more in depth than they are when you first find them. You can bring them up to rare quality, you can add a bunch of modifiers, and one of the stronger long-term setups, if you had your pick of any possible drops in the game, is actually literally just going around the outside of the skill tree to get as many jewel sockets as possible, and then just slotting in a bunch of high-tier jewels within them that have these stats that you're specifically wanting for your build. So these have a lot more possible power than some people assume at first glance, and it's important to be aware of how you can make them stronger. On the note of power, there are certain modifiers on gear that have very different value than they may appear to have at first glance. A couple of good examples are bonus levels to skills. This has the potential to increase your damage by a massive amount for those specific skills, because the actual skill levels gives you a lot of increase to your damage in this game. Or it's going to have other effects as well, depending on what the skill is. It can affect the utility too, and in most cases, these will be the highest individual gain you can get from one modifier slot on a piece of equipment, but every increased level of a skill also increases its mana cost, and so there is a balance that you have to find within your build even with this modifier, where bonus levels are worth a ton of extra damage, but only if you can sustain the significant cost increases to use them as well as you gain these bonus levels too. Another example is bonus physical damage or physical damage modifiers in general. Pretty much every strong endgame build uses elemental skills or spells, and while there are weapon bases that apply pure elemental damage, you would think those might synergize well, they're almost always outscaled by physical damage based weapons in the endgame. The main reason for this is that elemental skills always convert a portion of physical damage into their respective element regardless, but generally speaking, the endgame versions of weapons just have way more potential value by stacking loads of physical attack and then using the actual conversions from the skills to turn this giant pile of physical damage into the element that you want. An example being that I would far rather use a barrier quarterstaff quarterstaff, like this one, than a crackling quarterstaff, despite the majority of my damage being lightning and a crackling quarterstaff having a bunch of lightning damage on it, because I can scale the physical damage high enough on the barrier quarterstaff that the end result is just way higher output. On a somewhat similar note to wrap in an earlier tip, veteran players will know this, but you can make your build function around any element that you wanted to, realistically, at least if you know how to put it together. A good example is there are a number of high-end builds that have lots of cold damage and freeze application without using a single cold skill. The way they achieve these is through a mix of things like flat cold damage on your weapon, on your actual rings, your gloves, and then the passive tree choices as well. You can do things like increase your cold damage after the fact, or you can put in support gems and increase cold damage with specific skills, things like that, or even jewels, like we talked about earlier for your passive tree, can also increase cold damage. If you do this, you can get more potent damage increases, like Echoing Frost for increased damage after you freeze enemies, and then if you do that, you can start working on things like Herald of Ice, the actual persistent aura for a bunch of bonus AoE damage when you shatter a frozen enemy. Then you can combine that further with the Herald passive clusters that we talked about earlier too. The point is that a lot of people think far too closed off about Path of Exile systems. Any character can use any weapon type, any skill in the game, and do any damage type. Obviously there are particularly potent combinations, there are ways that make more sense to put it together, but you can make lightning skills do cold damage and have it actually make you stronger if you know what you're doing. But the more creatively you think about your build, the more potential power you may be able to achieve. Past that, I want to just take a moment and talk about Exalted and Divine Orbs. These currency items specifically are valuable as hell, and you want to treat them as such. Exalted Orbs have their obvious value of adding modifiers to rare gear, but Divine Orbs are like the ultra endgame economy drain. Once you have nearly perfect gear, the final stages of improving it is using tons of Divine Orbs to try and reroll all of the modifiers to be their highest possible values within the tier. And then of course a Bell Orb if you're feeling spicy. The point is that Exalted Orbs have a ton of innate value to every player of course, and the players who care about Divine Orbs the most are the people who generally have the most Exalted Orbs. As you get more and more deeper into the endgame, you get a lot more Exalteds. So these people are deciding the way that the economy sort of collapses down on the rest of us. In the in-game currency exchange a few days ago, you could get a Divine Orb for around 12 Exalteds. Yesterday it was up to 45 Exalteds, and as of the time that I'm recording this, it's over 62 Exalted Orbs for one Divine Orb, and that's only in a few days. This will continue to climb over the next few days as more and more players bust further into the endgame. More Exalted Orbs will start to exist, and more demand will crop up for Divine Orbs, so this rate will just keep climbing. All of this is basically just a long way of saying, if you want to stay able to do things with trading for the game long term, don't just hoard your Exalted Orbs, hoard your Divine Orbs even more cautiously, and more than that, if you have enough Exalted Orbs to trade for a Divine Orb, you probably should do that and just exchange into them unless you have imminent need for your Exalted Orbs, because Divine Orbs are again just going to climb in value for at least the next week or two, and then you can just cash them out for more Exalted Orbs later if you actually want to use your Exalteds at a later point. On a somewhat similar note, while we are sort of in the ballpark of trading, it can be used to significantly increase your power very quickly if you know what modifiers are good for your gear and are willing to use the website and have orbs to trade too. But one way to avoid getting shown items out of your price range is specifically setting the filter to only show items listed for Exalted Orbs. And of course, that's just one of many settings that you can use within the filters to actually narrow down your search results and have a better time collecting new equipment through this method. Outside of this, the other best way to get loads of gear is essentially just taking advantage of the map system correctly. Make a point of pathing through to lost towers as frequently as possible to begin with, create a sort of interwoven web of them, sort of Venn diagram style, stick in some strong precursor tablets that have been beefed up with modifiers, and then do the maps within the overlapping radius. There's a lot more nuance to it than that, of course, and we talked about it in much greater detail on the channel already if you'd like to check out our guides to sort of maximizing your endgame power curve efficiency through the map system, including Atlas tree recommendations too. Past that, just a couple more tips here then. First, take full advantage of your skill slots. I've seen some players work out their core synergies and then just sort of walk around with a bunch of empty gem slots, but this is just a waste. If you have Spirit, you can work in extra aura skills, the persistent buffs, either to boost offense or defense in some way, or if you don't have enough Spirit, you could get yourself some utility. Even something like Ice Nova to get some close range knockback in case of emergency. One trick that a lot of higher end players will use as well is, let's say you have 100 Spirit, you have one 30 cost aura that is great for everything, a 60 cost aura that is great for mobbing but not bossing, and a 60 cost aura that is great for bossing but not mobbing. If you have both of the 60 costs in your actual gem sockets, you can simply press G to look at your skills even while in the middle of a map, disable one aura and activate the other. That way you can swap between being in essentially mobbing or bossing mode. It's a bit of extra management, sure, but it can give you the extra edge that you need to make your build better at different types of content actively while in the middle of them, especially if you already had the extra skill gem slots to begin with and they were already already open. Another option is to take advantage of skills that require different weapons as well, and actually use your second weapon set if you haven't been doing that up to this point. Then finally, this is both a simple and a very important tip, and one that I mentioned in an earlier game guide at some point, but bears repeating, especially now that we are at the stage of the game where a lot of people are trying to put themselves into proper builds, moving away from just winging it and doing some more proper swaps and planning their future for this build. Through this process, you likely already have or soon will be refunding and allocating some passives, and even if you say no, you just will be eventually. I'm sorry to tell you this. Along that road to do so, you may need to change an attribute node. Maybe you just hit a different requirement to use different gear and you need to swap something over. Now you're like 5 dexterity short of equipping a different thing, and your attribute nodes in your skill tree are just weirdly far back from stuff. In order to refund it, you'd think you'd have to go all the way back out of the nodes that are in front of it as well, and then pay for all those in your refund, right? No, there's a simple trick. On the refund passives option screen, just click on any attribute node that you have taken, and you can just swap which attribute it is without having to do any of the other stuff, and all you have to do is pay for 1 passive point refund to achieve this. That pretty much does it for today then, everyone. A collection of tips to hopefully make your journey into the middle section of the endgame a little bit simpler in Path of Exile 2, and to help you avoid some of the mistakes that I made myself. I hope you've enjoyed this, and hopefully it helps make your journey better. Like if you liked the video, subscribe to the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.